Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah, I recently released a 5th book on fiqh, specifically Shafii fiqh. And so people are asking me now, well, which one should they get? And which one they should read? And the simple answer is you should get all of them, and you should read all of them. But that doesn't answer the question of which order you ought to read them in. So, inshallah, over the next few minutes, I'll try to answer some of those questions. So, first of all, if you're reading with a sheikh, and inshallah you will be, and that's the ideal situation, you're going to read whichever book they tell you to read. So, if they tell you to start with the Encompassing Epistle, that's what you start with. If they tell you that they want you to read Sharh al-Waraqat with them, then that's what you start with. If you have an instructor who is committed to teaching you the Shafii madhab and the contents of these books, then you follow what they tell you to study, you follow their curriculum, because they have a plan and it's best to stick to it. If you're studying with me, my advice would be that you would start with the Encompassing Epistle. And the reason for this is that it's going to give you your basic fard al-ain, or the basic personally obligatory knowledge that every Muslim needs to have. Now, it doesn't cover everything, but it covers the core. So it covers basic creed, and then it covers basic acts of worship that every Muslim is likely going to need, either every day, or once a year, or once in their life. So it's going to cover the basic acts of worship. And then at the end, it talks about tasawwuf, or the purification of the soul. And one of the reasons that it includes that is that, according to Imam al-Ghazali, this is like the end of fiqh. This is the highest form of fiqh. So as you learn your fiqh and you perfect your fiqh, your perfection of your heart is going to be one of the things that you would need to concentrate on. Now, it's complementary, and you can't just jump straight to purification of the heart. You're going to have to go through everything else too. So anyways, in the Encompassing Epistle, I've included the basic text of a Risala al-Jamia, and I've also included commentary. And the commentary that I added is to try to help people put into practice what's in there without a lot of explanation. And it also includes just a little bit of evidence so that you can be confident that the rulings that are included in the book should be followed. So that when you act upon them, you can be confident that when you meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have done something that He and His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam commanded you to do. Okay, so when it comes to fiqh and creed, that's what's going to be in there. When it comes to purification of the heart, it's going to be a little bit more complicated, because the creed you can memorize. The fiqh that it includes, you can memorize. But when it comes to the tasawwuf and the tazkiyah, the perfection of the self at the end, this is something that you're going to be working on for your entire life. So that last part of the book is something that, while you might be advancing in other disciplines, you're still going to have to go back there to work on those. But that's why we move on to the next section, the next book, okay? So I would start everyone with the Encompassing Epistle. Even if they've read before, just go back. Make sure that you've mastered what's in there. Make sure that that information is familiar to you, because you might find that you were doing something wrong. So go back, read something like the Encompassing Epistle with me or with a real sheikh, inshallah, put it into practice. And once you've got the creed memorized, and once you've got the basic fiqh memorized, then you move on to something like the Accessible Conspectus. Now, the Accessible Conspectus is my contemporary commentary on Abu Shuja' al-Asfahani's Ghayat al-Taqrib, or Ghayat al-Ikhtisar, which I translated into the Ultimate Conspectus. Now, why not just read the Ultimate Conspectus first? Well, it's just too short. If you open up the Ultimate Conspectus, you're going to notice it's a list of things. And while it's great to memorize, unless you know what those things mean and how to put them into practice, it's not very practical. And we want knowledge that can be translated into action. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered and prohibited in order for it to be put into practice, not just to be memorized. And so you're going to have to understand everything that is in that book in order to put it into practice. So I tried to do this. I tried to help people do this by writing a commentary. Instead of translating an old commentary, I sat down and I thought, you know what? If I was going to teach this book to someone who didn't know fiqh at all, like my kids, what would I do? How would I do it? If I were to die today and I wanted my kids to be able to learn fiqh the easiest way possible, what would I do? Okay, so that's what I put in the Accessible Conspectus. So in the Accessible Conspectus, I wanted to introduce concepts to people. What is fiqh about? What are the chapters of fiqh? Why are those chapters even there? What are the different issues that fall within each chapter? And what do these things mean? I mean, when we start reading about trade, unless you're a lawyer, or unless you're someone who's like an advanced businessman, you don't know about trade very much. And unless you're doing family law or family counseling, you probably don't know marriage very well. But when you study fiqh, you have to cover all of these things. When you study fiqh, you're going to have to cover purification, prayer, zakat, fasting. You're going to have to cover hajj. Then you're going to have to cover trade. You have to handle inheritance, marriage, divorce. You're going to have to handle punishments, crimes. You're going to have to handle all of those things, right? So when you study a full range fiqh book, you have to get into everything. You have to get into everything related to acts of worship, family law, trade law. Then you have to get into things dealing with justice and even how to slaughter animals and how to deal with court cases. This is something that a basic student of fiqh is expected to be familiar with. And for most of us, those things aren't familiar to us. Whether we're talking about sacred law or secular law, most of us don't know these things. We don't have to think about it. When you go to the supermarket and you buy something, you don't think about what are the requirements of a valid sale. Is it actually halal and haram for me to buy what I'm doing? You don't think about these things. But if you're dealing with fiqh, you have to. So what I did in the Accessible Conspectus is I took the Ultimate Conspectus, which is very, very thin. It's like a skeleton. And I tried to put flesh onto it. Okay, I tried to flesh it out and make it accessible to today's audiences. So in there, you're going to find examples that are a little bit easier to grasp in today's world. So in the old books, they would talk about, if a pig and a dog were to have children with another species. Okay, great. That's what the old books talk about. So my kids would want to hear about, genetic engineering and hybrids and chimeras and things like this. So we could take the old examples, but put it into a more contemporary context. Okay? So what I did in the book is I tried to come up with examples that would be more suitable for today's time, something that you're familiar with. So I start people with the Accessible Conspectus. And what I tend to do with this book is for every chapter and for every issue, I give a definition. What is it? And then I give what's its basis from the Quran and the Sunnah and consensus if there is, or it's the basis for its analogical inclusion. I do this so that people know why that subject is even going to be there. So why, for example, do we even deal with contests and races and marksmanship? Why is this an issue that the fuqaha would be talking about? Well, easy, because the Prophet ﷺ talked about it. And we have commands and prohibitions related to it. So that means that it has legal rulings associated with it. So the fuqaha are going to have to include it in their books. So in each chapter and issue, I tried to explain to people why it's even a legal issue. And I try to give some hints at some of the textual evidence that comes into play for each of those pieces. And then when it comes to the subject matter from the Ultimate Conspectus, I try to flesh everything out, explain what he's talking about, why he's talking about it. I also try to include an explanation about why issues flow the way they do. Why do we talk about water and then we talk about skins and tanning? Well, if you're going to carry water to make wudu, if you need water to make wudu, you need to be able to transport it places, right? And if you're going to transport it places, you have to put it into a container. And a lot of containers were made out of animal products like skin and bladders. So you have to talk about purification. So Abu Shuja and small books don't tell you the rationale behind their ordering. And a lot of the big books don't either. But it's something that if you know the rationale about how things fit together, it helps you better appreciate these books. And it can also help you memorize the material better. And so anyways, I tried to include this in the Accessible Conspectus. Now, if you've read really basic Shafii fiqh in Arabic, you've probably read Ibn Qasim al-Ghazi's Sharh Matan Abi Shuja, known as Fath al-Qarib. Now, this is something that every Shafii student is going to read sometime. And it's where we start with. When I wrote the Accessible Conspectus, I consulted this book a lot to try to make sure that most of the material that you would read in there is in my book in some way. So that after reading Accessible Conspectus, if you were to read the same material in Arabic, there wouldn't be really that much new stuff. It's a new language, but it's familiar concepts. Because we really didn't have books like this when I was starting to read fiqh. Yeah, we had Reliance of the Traveler, but it was overkill. It was so rich that it was difficult to go from the encyclopedic knowledge that it contained back to the really early fiqh books that we'd be reading. So the Accessible Conspectus is designed to take a novice student and introduce them to basic Shafii fiqh concepts from A to Z, and it's going to make it much easier for them to transition into Arabic books, and it's going to make it a snap to transition up to a book like Reliance of the Traveler. Okay, seriously, I tried to make it as easy as possible for people to transition over. Now, Accessible Conspectus will include some evidence for why we include topics, but it doesn't include evidence for the specific rulings, okay? Because at this point, a student isn't really in a position where they can understand the arguments behind this. Okay, so I've mentioned the Encompassing Epistle, which I would say to read first, and then the Accessible Conspectus. Now, if you're reading Accessible Conspectus, it's handy to have the Ultimate Conspectus around you for the sake of review and memorization. But you don't have to. It makes it a lot easier, but you don't have to have it. Now, after reading Accessible Conspectus, I would recommend either moving on to Reliance of the Traveler or moving on to my Sharh al-Waraqat. And what Sharh al-Waraqat is it is Imam al-Mahalli's commentary on Imam al-Juwayni's al-Waraqat fi usul al-fiqh. So it's a basic introductory primer on the principles of Islamic jurisprudence. And in that book, you're going to learn about the sources of law and how we will interpret sources of law and how they fit together. What do we do when we find conflicting evidence? When we find apparently conflicting evidence? Because the evidence really can't be in true conflict. If it appears to us to be in conflict, we have to have some way to reconcile that. And this book is one of those books that's going to teach you how to do it. Now, it's not an advanced primer in usul al-fiqh. Anyone who has read usul is going to tell you that this is the very, very first step we take. But it's an important first step. And it's an essential first step. And it has to be taken before you can start looking at evidence and understanding how legal arguments are made. And so, after reading Accessible Conspectus, I would recommend reading Sharh al-Waraqat. Now, you really should read it with a sheikh, and it would be great to take time to go through it with lots of additional explanation, but it's not essential. As long as you understand the subject matter of Sharh al-Waraqat, you can move on to the next book, inshallah. And that next book is the one that I just published, which is the Evident Memorandum. Now, if you're like a stickler, you're going to say, no, you can't move on. But wait a sec. We're not trying to teach people to be fuqaha yet. We're trying to teach people to be able to read what the fuqaha write and understand their arguments, not to be mujtahids, not to be able to construct their own legal arguments. We're trying to get people so that they can be literate in fiqh and be able to understand what's being written. So if you work in the sciences, you have to learn how to read a scientific report, right? That amount of literacy doesn't mean that you can go and do those experiments yourself and that research yourself. But a certain amount of literacy and understanding is needed in order to understand what's going on in those reports, right? So just like someone with a little bit of knowledge in statistical methods and other research methods can go and read social science findings, okay? Just like they can do that, people can learn a certain amount of usul al-fiqh so that they can then appreciate and benefit from evidence-based fiqh books. And that's what I want to move people up to next. So the Evident Memorandum, which is the last book that I just did, is kind of a bit of a weird book, right? Because there's no commentary. It's not a direct translation. Okay? So just like the Accessible Conspectus wasn't a direct translation of someone else's commentary, the Evident Memorandum also isn't a direct translation. So if you go and you talk to any of your Shafii friends who studied in Arabic fiqh, and you told them, I'm reading the Accessible Conspectus, they're going to look at you like, what? Never heard of it. We don't read that. And if you do the same, I'm reading the Evident Memorandum by this dude named Musa Ferber, they're going to have no idea what you're reading because those two books don't exist in the Arabic library. Okay? These are original works because we need something somewhat original for English-speaking audiences because, well, we live in a different age and we need new examples and all of that. So anyways, the Evident Memorandum is my commentary on Ibn Mulaqin's At-Tadhkira fi Furu' al-Shafi'iyya or something like that, all right? So At-Tadhkira is by Ibn Mulaqin, who is a Shafii faqih who lived in a time between Imam Nawawi and, say, Imam al-Mahalli, who you might not have heard of, but you've probably heard of people like Zakaria al-Ansari and Ibn Hajar and Ar-Ramli. So anyways, he was in like the third generation of scholars after Imam Nawawi, but before the very, very late referent scholars came, okay? So Ibn Mulaqin, no one's going to read his book, this book that I translated, okay? But I picked it because it's a little bit bigger than Abu Shuja, the Ultimate Conspectus. It has a ton of material that you would never find in a similarly small book because it's really dense, okay? So I picked it because I wanted to introduce people to a huge amount of material that they wouldn't have gotten without jumping up to a really big book like The Reliance of the Traveler. I'm lazy. I didn't want to translate it's 24,000 words. I didn't want to jump up to 24,000 words. I wanted to keep things small. Okay, so I translated Ibn Mulaqin's At-Tadhkira fil Furu'. And I did it because it has the same coverage of Abu Shuja and then maybe another 30% of new issues. Okay, so it's barely bigger than his book, but it still has a lot more information. And it even has some stuff that you're not going to find in Reliance or The Traveler. Obviously, Reliance has a lot of stuff that you're not going to find in it. But I wanted a new book, so if you had read the Ultimate Conspectus or the Accessible Conspectus, you're going to get exposed to that same material, but in different expressions. And when you see something different, it's going to force you to reflect on what you already knew. And maybe it will help you expose a misunderstanding. Maybe it will enrich previous understanding. Maybe it will enforce that understanding. But either way, when we see the same concept expressed in a different way, and we start noticing differences between the two books, because the order is sometimes different, all of this is going to increase your familiarity and your understanding of that information. It builds connections and all of that. So I wanted to make sure that in my Shafii curriculum, I had more than one fiqh book for people to read. So I wanted something other than Abu Shuja for people to read. So I translated Ibn Mulaqin's At-Tadhkira. And some people have asked, why do At-Tadhkira when we don't read it in Arabic? Well, he's an author that I think people should know about. He made some pretty significant contributions to Shafii fiqh that we don't really realize today because later scholars redeveloped his work. And so we sometimes forget that when we read a lot of late books, there's echoes of his work in it. A lot of the late takhrij work wouldn't exist without him. Some of the fiqh books we probably wouldn't have if not for him. So anyways, I wanted people to be able to tap in and to appreciate this person that we don't read that much. Even in Arabic audiences, they don't really appreciate him because they don't read him directly anymore. So I wanted to revive a book that isn't well known. And also, Ibn Mulaqin rahimahullah, apparently he wrote this book for one of his kids. And I thought that was really sweet for an author, yani not only an author, but an alama, a great luminary scholar, to take time to write a book for one of his kids. Now, after writing the Accessible Conspectus with my kids in mind, how could I not want to revive the book of a great scholar who did the same? Okay, so I took the Tadhkira, translated it, and then I added evidence to it. And the reason I wanted to focus on evidence is that we live in an age where we really need to know why we do things. We might not need to have very detailed, intricate reasons, but we at least need to know what is the religious basis behind the actions we take. Because a lot of the things we do today, they come from Islam, but we've kind of like lost the connection to the religious basis. So they've become customs, they've become habits. And I wanted to refresh and to remind people about the underlying religious basis of this. And so I wanted to have some evidence there. So when people ask us, or when we ask ourselves, why do we do it? The answer is more than just, well, Sheikh so-and-so told me to do it. Okay, Sheikh so-and-so is probably a very qualified scholar, and we should follow what he says, but don't we want to know why he said so? Okay, so I wanted to be able to answer that. And this isn't because I want to equip myself or anyone else to make ijtihad, because you're not going to do that through English. You're going to have to master Arabic, and you're going to have to master all of the source material to do that. Now, if I could contribute to that, mashallah, that would be an awesome thing to have among my deeds on Yawmul Qiyamah. But that's not what I set out to do, and definitely none of the work that I've done would enable someone to do that. But what I did want to do is I wanted to enrich our understanding of why we do the things we do. I also wanted to make sure that people could understand that a lot of the things that people are saying are merely cultural are well-founded in the early sources, that we can find them in the Quran or the Sunnah, or we can get to them through analogy. So I wanted people who were studying fiqh, whether it's Shafii fiqh or some other fiqh, to be able to pull open a book and know, why do we do the aqiqah? Why do we require witnesses when we get married? Why do we say that we can only marry particular people? Why do we have restrictions on what food we can eat? I wanted people to be able to quickly look up in a reference why things are the way they are. Now, if you're not a Shafi'i, it's still beneficial to know these things. If you're studying another madhab, it's still beneficial to know these things, right? So I tried to do this in the Evident Memorandum. Now, I'm not qualified to just write one of these commentaries off the top of my head. And I didn't want to take someone else's words and impose them on Ibn Mulaqin, especially when Ibn Mulaqin himself had written several commentaries on fiqh works. Ibn Mulaqin, rahimahullah, he has 2 commentaries on the Minhaj of Imam Nawawi. He has a commentary on al-Hawi al-Saghir, which is an incredibly dense and advanced metin in Shafii fiqh. It's one that most people today can't even really crack, because of its difficulty and its density. He wrote a commentary on a small metin we don't read anymore, called Mukhtasar Tabrizi. And in that commentary, he said that he wanted to bring out the essential rulings and the essential differences of opinion and the essential arguments that any introductory Shafii student should know. And so I took that book and I used that as the basis for my commentary. So I took Ibn Mulaqin's commentary on another book and I used it to explain another of his books. But it wasn't enough, so I went to his bigger books. And in places where I couldn't find the textual evidence in those books, I went to some of his other books where he concentrated on the hadiths that are cited in the Shafii madhab, or where he gave the hadith evidence for the opinions of Imam Nawawi's Minhaj. So in the Evident Memorandum, what I tried to do is explain Ibn Mulaqin's Tadhkira using Ibn Mulaqin's explanation on other fiqh books. And so while it's original research, it's, insha'Allah, a commentary that Ibn Mulaqin could have written. Now, obviously, he would have done a much better job because he's the faqih and I'm the student. But it's something that, insha'Allah, was written the way that he would have done it if he had written a commentary. So that's what I tried to do in the Evident Memorandum. So again, what order would I recommend and what order would I teach people in? The Encompassing Epistle, Accessible Conspectus, with people doing review through Ultimate Conspectus. But I wouldn't want people to read Ultimate Conspectus on their own because it's not very useful without a commentary or a sheikh to explain it. Then I would want people to read Sharh al-Waraqat so that they can learn the framework that the fuqaha use when they approach textual evidence and how they put it together, and so that they would be familiar with the sources of law. And then I would get into the Evident Memorandum so that people would understand the basis for the rulings that we have in the madhab. Now, Accessible Conspectus is an original English work, and I tried to make it, I did my best to make it as easy as possible to English audiences. Some people have said that, if someone were to write fiqh in English from scratch, it could sound like this. Okay, it doesn't sound like a translation. Evident Memorandum is probably going to sound like a translation to people, and its order is a little bit different. It's not as wordy as Accessible Conspectus is. Accessible Conspectus really is accessible. I tried to make it so that today's readers could learn fiqh without any obstacles. So language wouldn't be an obstacle. The examples wouldn't be an obstacle. I tried to make it as easy as possible so that they could get up to speed. Evident Memorandum expects you to know that stuff already. It's not going to teach novices fiqh. It's going to teach people who already have a good familiarity, a good foundation in fiqh. So the Evident Memorandum, it's not going to teach you fiqh. It's not going to teach you basic rulings. It assumes that you already know them. Now, the commentary is going to add a bit to it, okay? But unless you've already read something like Accessible Conspectus or Reliance of the Traveler, Evident Memorandum is going to be a huge jump. So my advice, read them in order, and it's going to go much quicker than if you were to try to read Evident Memorandum from the very, very beginning. So that's my recommendation. What if you don't have anyone to read with? I would try to go in the same order, and I would try to find someone that you can ask questions to. Maybe, inshallah, in the future, I could do a lesson for each of those books for people that don't have the benefit of living in a community where they can study with a sheikh. But that's going to have to be something in the future. So, inshallah, I hope this has given a bit of an answer of which book you should get. The answer is all of them. What order should you read them in? the Encompassing Epistle, Accessible Conspectus, Sharh al-Waraqat, and then Evident Memorandum. So, inshallah, this is enough of an answer. Wherever you're listening or watching this, I'll try to give you some links so that you can go find those books if you want to buy them online. And I also ask that if you're finding this beneficial, share it with other people. If there's a subscribe button that you can hit it. If there's a like button that you can hit and you liked it, hit like. If there's something I said you don't like, go ahead, give me a thumbs down, and then maybe you can tell me what's wrong, and I'll try to answer, or I'll try to do better. So this is 30 minutes long now. It's a lot longer than I expected to go. And so I hope this is enough of an answer. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.